Hi, this is Ann with Fiber Designs by Ann, and today I'm painting a fabric that I hope to use for the binding on my Open Wreath free motion small art quilt. I'm doing a little bit of experimenting because I have not used this before. I've taken a piece of cloth covered wire and I've shaped it into a kind of a flower, and I have a little lid that I will mix up some paint in. I'm using Jacquard textile colors in yellow, red, true red, sky blue, and some white. I have a piece of fine cotton fabric, and this is actually the fabric that the quilt is made out of that I hand painted also. I have my homemade frame. It doesn't quite fit in the picture or in the frame. I'll try to move it around so you can see as I go. I have a cork, which is how I apply the fabric to these very sharp tacks that are on my homemade stretcher frame for my fabric. I have little containers that I can put water and the paint in, and just using some cheap brushes for this. I'm on a surface that can be painted. I have a spray bottle for water. Okay, let's get started. I'm also using a little mist water bottle as well. So I start by putting a little bit of paint, yellow and the blue, in the containers. And my brushes have been dampened. It takes just a tiny bit of paint, and I'll add a little water to them so that they're more watercolor consistency. So I'll set those aside, and now I'm going to mix up my pink. These colors were chosen because of the quilt top, the colors that are in it. My white was a little chunky, so it took some mixing. And I'm just putting it into that recycled lid. And only a teeny bit of the red. Red's such a strong pigment. And mix it really well. And it's felt a little dry, so I added a little bit of water. Want it to be consistency, in this case, that it covers the bottom of that lid, so I'll be able to dip my little flower stamp, wire stamp in it. So I'm going to set this aside now. And I'm going to attach my fabric to my frame. Normally I would have that fabric all damp, but I didn't. I used the spray bottle, and I'm going to put it on the tacks. If it was all wet, it would stretch pretty even, but because part of it's dry, I'm going to put it on, and I may have to, after it gets totally damp, I may have to lift some of the fabric off of the tacks and stretch it again, because once those fibers are wet, they really stretch. Just make sure that it's totally covered with water, but I don't want it soppy wet. If it's too wet, then I would use a towel or something to dry it off, to take some of that excess water out. Just want to make sure it's evenly covered in dampness, because if it's dry, anywhere that paint hits, I'm not going to be able to move it or blend it. I'm going to start with my wire flower, and I got it a little damp because it's covered in fabric, and I wanted it to absorb the paint a little bit better. And then I'm just going to tap and tap into the lid with the bit of paint. Oh, it feels like it's covered well. The stamp isn't totally flat, so that's going to make a difference in how it hits the fabric, but I'm okay with this. I cut very skinny binding, and the pink may not even show, so whatever I do will be just great. And then I just randomly tap it all over the piece, filling it up as much as I want, or as little as I want, all over the surface. This could have been done on a slightly padded surface without being on the frame, but then I would have had to move it again to paint it, so that's why it's just better for me to have done it all on the frame. Then I'm going to take a paintbrush and very, very lightly drag it across each of the flowers. This is going to do a couple things. One of the things it's going to do is push that paint down into the fabric a little better, and it's also going to smooth out any raised white paint that might be still there. I'm okay if it kind of blurs them. And this is all wet, it's still wet. I'm going to start with my blue paint. And the paintbrush is going to leave lines, but because this is all damp, I'll be able to blend them and rub them out. But if that bothers you, you can use a soft brush and mop it across, and then you won't have the line issue. But I'm okay with that, because I know I'm going to be spritzing some water or misting some water on there and moving it more and more. I'm painting this at a diagonal because of my small bindings I cut, and I don't want the binding to have stripes going through it. It looks too formal that way. I'd rather it was a little more organic. So painting it on a diagonal and cutting a straight strip through it will give me what I want when I piece the binding together. So I'm using the mist water to keep it blending so that I get rid of those lines from the paintbrush. And I'm going to move to since I'm with the blue, I'm going to move to the opposite corner and do the same thing. And then I'm going to add the yellow, which is really intense. And I don't want this to be all blue and yellow, so I really, really blend the yellow so I get a lot of green, a lot more green. I'm going to put some music on, and you can just watch me do all this painting. Now that the paint is all blended, I'm going to just use up the rest of that paint in the lid of the flower from the flower stamp, and I'm just going to stamp it all over. This is just giving it another layer. After I've done that, I'm going to use the rest of my blue paint with the paintbrush and get it real saturated. And then I'm going to just tap, splatter dots across the surface. If you do this, be careful, it goes everywhere. Just all over, just giving it one more layer. So this is my piece of fabric, and instead of just letting it dry and then heat setting it, I decided to take it to the sink because it was so bright and I was okay with any paint washing out of it, which sometimes can happen if you used hot water. And I did use hot water and a little bit of soap, and I just really scrubbed it and really washed it because I was okay with losing some of the brightness. It stayed pretty bright, and I'm okay with that. The dots don't show as much on the back, but I could use the back. It's a little more muted. So I'm going to see if this will work for the binding for my Open Wreath art quilt, and I'll show you the finished product. And here's the quilt with the binding being applied. Here are a couple of the corners, and you can see I beaded this quilt as well. And here's the finished quilt. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please subscribe and give it a thumbs up. This has been Ann. Thanks a lot for watching.